Hello and welcome to a new MuSkeMo tutorial. This is Pasha van Bijlert speaking. In this tutorial I'm going to show you how MuSkeMo and Blender's user interfaces work. This tutorial picks up where the previous tutorial left off, so I'm going to assume that you've installed both Blender and MuSkeMo. And if everything has gone according to plan, you will have a button on the right over here labeled MuSkeMo. If you click on it, you will see all of these panels. These panels can be opened and collapsed, and actually if you click and drag on these, you can even reorder them in any way that you like. So this is where MuSkeMo lives, in these panels. I've made a sample dataset available, which you can use to familiarize yourself with MuSkeMo, and I'm also going to be downloading it and importing it for this tutorial. So this is also available from Github, so if we go to the releases page, you can scroll down to the MuSkeMo sample dataset and download MuSkeMo sample dataset 1.zip. I've done this already, and I've also unzipped the folder. And in the folder you can find an emu and a horse folder, so I'm going to import the emu model. To do that, we go to we go back into Blender, and first of all we're also going to delete this cube. So just select it and delete it. We don't need the default cube. Then we hit importing, and we're going to import an OpenSim model. I'm going to click parametric wraps, which is useful for this tutorial, but in general you won't need it unless you want to modify a model. I'm going to hit import OpenSim model and then navigate to the emu model, which is over here, and I just select it and hit import OpenSim model, and it's imported, and we immediately see a warning. And MuSkeMo gives you warnings when importing existing models, because certain features, of course, will require some manual tuning. In this case, MuSkeMo is giving you a warning for wrap settings, which aren't completely identical when comparing OpenSim and MuSkeMo. So we've imported our first model, and I think this is a good point to introduce you to navigation in Blender. I'm not going to go over every Blender feature and setting in this tutorial. If you are new to Blender, I highly recommend you watch Blender Guru's donut tutorials. That's essentially how I learned how to use Blender as well. He's very thorough. How do we move around? So the first maybe is to just scroll forward and backwards. That lets us zoom in and out. By the way, at the bottom left of the screen, I cannot currently see it, but you should be able to. You can see both the keys that I'm pressing and the mouse buttons that I'm pressing. By scrolling, I can zoom in and out, and by default, Blender scrolls towards the midpoint of the screen. By pressing the middle mouse button and dragging, I can rotate around rotate the camera around the scene. This is called orbiting. Now, you might notice that I'm trying to get the model orientated so that the up direction of the model aligns with the up direction of Blender, but that's not possible by default. So at the top of the screen here, you can see the global reference system, and you can see that Blender actually by default prefers Z is up, whereas this model is constructed assuming that Y is up. And that's giving me problems because Blender is essentially forcing me to keep Z as the up direction. So because I prefer Y is up, I have a button that changes several Blender settings. It's under the global settings panel. If you click it and you hit set recommended navigation settings, first of all, you're able to orbit so that Y becomes the up direction. This is called trackball. This is the trackball setting in Blender. And what also has changed is that if you select something, Blender will now orbit around your selection. If you want to change these are both available under Edit, Preferences, and then Navigation. See, but the button sets these both in one click. So we can scroll to zoom in and out. We can drag with the middle mouse button to orbit. What if I want to move from side to side? Well, then I hit Shift and once again middle mouse button, and then I can drag from side to side. If I want to move any object, I simply select it and then press G, which stands for grab, and then I can just move it at will. If I move this over here and then turn around, I can see that I've also moved, I've not only moved it to the back, but I've also moved it to the side. So if I want to prevent that, I can press G and then, for instance, press X to move about the global X direction. And if I press X again, I'm actually moving about the local X direction, but right now you can't see the difference because the object is aligned to the global reference system. So for instance, if I want to rotate about Z, I press R, Z, and now I can rotate. And now, because the object is no longer in its regular, in its original orientation, if I press G and then X, well, now I'm moving about global X, but I can press X again, and now I'm moving about local X. So the shorthand for this is if you press the axis once, you move about the global axis. If you press the axis again, you transform about the local axis. Just like any other program, Control-Z works in Blender to undo things. While editing the tutorial, I realized that I wanted to demonstrate a Blender setting that visualizes local reference frames of selected objects. So by default, when you select an object, you can't tell how it's orientated. But if you press this button over here, which is the Viewport Gizmos button, and you select the Move gizmo, and you select the Move gizmo, now you see that this little local reference frame appeared when I select this object. If I select this object, it'll be over here. But as long as the transform orientation up here is set to global, these arrows will always be aligned to the global reference frame. If we set this to local, now the arrows will always be aligned to the orientation of the object in question. So I don't have this setting on while recording this tutorial, but if this is something you like, then you can turn this on. These gizmos also allow you to click and drag along the arrow directions. We have this whole model imported. That means that everything is already parented in the way that we would like it to be parented in Blender. In this case, I was moving a visual geometry mesh which has no children, but if I, for instance, move a body around, like this shank R body, if I press G, then you will see that all of its children, and including the muscles that are parented to the body, get moved. So if I want to rotate a joint about one of the joint axes, I select the joint, press R, and then, for instance, press Z twice to rotate about local Z. So this is the flexion extension axis in this model. It kind of depends on how you define it for your model, but this is how it works in this specific model. If your computer has a number pad to the right of the keyboard, then you can use that to automatically switch to different views. You can press 1, 3, 7, 9, etc. So 1 shows you the view along the y-axis, 3 along the x-axis, and 7 along the z-axis, which in our case is probably the most useful. If you select an object, and for instance, somehow your object is badly aligned, if you select an object and press the period on your number pad, it centers that object, which is quite useful. You can also select specific objects and then press slash, that brings you into a dedicated view that only includes those objects, and you have to press slash again to go out of that view. One final thing before we dive into further MuSkeMo features is Blender's autosave. Now this can be a lifesaver. I've found that Blender is usually quite stable, but sometimes Blender can crash. And if it does, if you haven't saved your work recently, you can always go to autosave, and you will find that, for instance, this version of the scene is 1 minute old, and if I click it, I will have lost almost no work. This has definitely been a lifesaver to me several times, so I thought it was worth pointing out in the tutorial. Now we have our model and we're able to manipulate it if we like. Let's have a look at where MuSkeMo stores all of your data and how to access MuSkeMo's features. Let's start with collections. So all of the different component types are stored in these collections on the right. A collection is simply a folder, and during model import or object creation, all of the objects of a specific type are placed in these collections. So for instance, for a body, if I select it, and I select it in the outliner over here, that's what this little folder is called, then you will see that the actual object in the scene is also selected, and it works the other way around as well. If I select it here, it's also selected in the outliner. So Blender shows you what object is selected and what objects are active by highlighting them in the viewport and in the outliner. And actually, you might not have noticed, but the selected object changes here as well. So if you keep watching this foot R over here, if I select something else, well, the active object becomes toes R. And to the left, we see here the active collection. So currently it's contacts. If I select it over here, the active collection became the bodies collection. The way that all of these components are created in MuSkeMo is by using an existing Blender object and then assigning extra metadata to each of these objects. Abstract properties like mass, center of mass, etc., these don't exist natively in Blender. So I've assigned them via something called custom properties. If I select an object and we press this yellow square, which is the object properties of this specific object. If I press this yellow square, and you'll have to scroll down, you will find something called custom properties. Here we see all of the data that was assigned to this specific body during import. So for instance, center of mass, the inertia about the center of mass, the mass of the object. If there's a local frame assigned to this body, you will find it here. And if there's visual geometry assigned to this object, you'll find it here. All of these, if you can resize this, by the way, just like all of MuSkeMo's panels, all of these will have tooltip overlays that give you so if you hover over them with your mouse, you will see you will get some extra explanation. Of course, you can read the manual for an in-depth explanation. So it's worth pointing out that custom properties are accessible in two ways. The first is if you select the object, go to Object Properties, so this yellow square, and then scroll down. This is the way that I just showed you. And the other is actually accessible by navigating out of MuSkeMo. So if you go to the Item panel, while the object is selected, so in this case the foot R body, if I click Properties, I will see the exact same properties that I see over here. Now in the item panel, we can also transform the selected object. For instance, I could change the X location of the body, but in general, you don't really want to move things around in a parented model, because then you are transforming objects away from their construction pose, their default pose. Now this item panel is only accessible when you're outside of MuSkeMo. So in general, while constructing the model, you'll probably access the custom properties here more often. Every object type created by MuSkeMo has a MuSkeMo type, which is in all caps. So a body will be body, obviously. a joint will have a MuSkeMo type joint, muscles will have MuSkeMo type muscle, etc., etc. All of the different types of components will have different types of data that can be assigned to them, and in general, most of these you should not touch yourself. You should let MuSkeMo's panels and functions deal with these, because if you change them yourself, there's a chance that you change something manually that doesn't carry over to the rest of the model. For instance, if you want to assign a child body to a joint, you cannot just type in the child body. You have to assign it using one of the buttons in the panels. So all of MuSkeMo's features are accessible through these panels. So for instance, in the body panel, you can, if you would like to create a new body, then you have to type in the name and press the button. And in general, this is how all of the functions in MuSkeMo work. You simply select target objects and you press a button. MuSkeMo's panels will show you which objects are selected that the specific panel can act on. So for instance, in the joint panel, it will tell you if you've selected a joint. If you've selected multiple joints, it actually gives you the number of joints you've selected as well. And joints, for instance, can be parented to bodies. They can have both a child and a parent body. So MuSkeMo's joint panel also shows you which bodies have been selected. Now, these are already assigned joints and parents, but if I press the button, I get an error telling me what I did wrong. So for instance, if I want to unparent the ankle joint, so I want currently the child body of the ankle joint is the foot R body. If I want to unparent this, I can clear it by selecting the joint, which is now selected, as you can see here, and then I just press clear child body, and now you can see that these things are no longer parented. I can redo the parenting by selecting both the joint and the body and pressing assign child body, and now everything works again as expected. So everything in MuSkeMo works by selection and button pressing. I've tried to make things as intuitive as possible. One final thing that we should go over, in some cases, certain object types will have Blender modifiers to get the desired behavior. So one of these object types is muscles. So muscles will have custom properties such as Fmax and optimal fiber length, but they will also have modifiers. And these modifiers, in this case, these are all hook modifiers. These are to literally hook each of the muscle points in the muscle to specific bodies. And there's a hook modifier for the wrapping object, as you can see here. This allows the wrapping to occur. You can change the behavior of the modifiers in the modifier panel. So for instance, for this muscle, I've scrolled down in the modifier panel. That's this wrench, and I go to the wrapping node. If I want to flip the wrap, I can, for instance, press this button. Of course, we don't want to flip the wrap in this case, but these modifiers allow you to change the behavior of certain features that are applied to this object. Muscles, for instance, can also have their radius, visualization radius changed. But in this case, the default radius actually is quite nice. So this wraps up the introductory tutorial. In follow-up tutorials, I will show you how to construct models, how to convert them to other simulator types such as OpenSim, how to make visualizations, etc., etc. I'll go through all of the panels and possibilities in depth as well. Thanks for watching.